Welcome. I'm Michael Frederick, Executive Director of the Thoreau Society. Hello, and thank you for joining us. Tonight, we'll have a conversation with our panelists that will go until 7:40 p.m. Please use the Q&A feature to post your questions. The Center for Biological Diversity and the Thoreau Society have teamed up for this exciting Earth Day program, Resistance and Extinction, a conversation about Thoreau, loss, and hope. For our viewers, let me tell you a little bit about our two organizations. The Center for Biological Diversity, founded in 1989, is one of the nation's leading wildlife and environmental protection organizations. Founded in 1941, the Thoreau Society is the largest and oldest organization devoted to an American author. The Society has members from more than 20 countries around the world, the Penobscot Nation, and all 50 US states. The writer Henry David Thoreau wrote in his 1851 essay, Walking, that in wildness is the preservation of the world. These words link us together today on Earth Day. Tonight's talk is a bit of a prelude to the Thoreau Society's annual gathering in July, when Peter Galvin will be joining us and awarding conservation biologist George Schaller with the 2020 Thoreau Prize for Literary Excellence in Nature Writing, a prize given annually by the Thoreau Society. We hope you will join us then. Visit thoreausociety.org tonight for more details. Getting on to our conversation, we are joined by Tierra, who is a senior scientist at the Center for Biological Diversity, where she leads the Saving Life on Earth campaign to end the global extinction crisis. Peter Galvin is Director of Programs and a founder of the Center for Biological Diversity. Peter grew up in Framingham, Massachusetts, close to Walden Pond, and hiked extensively in Walden Woods throughout his youth. Rochelle Johnson is president of the Thoreau Society and a professor of environmental studies at the College of Idaho. She writes about early American understandings of nature and what they teach us about both our current climate crisis and ourselves. Laura Dassa Walls is an author and the Thoreau biographer who has written Henry David Thoreau, A Life. She teaches in the English department at the University of Notre Dame and is looking forward to retiring soon and moving home to Seattle, where she will be taking up writing full-time, starting with a biography of Barry Lopez, who, she says, in so many ways is a reincarnated Thoreau in our time. Griselda Olvera and Naaman Hampton are assisting with technical support and will help monitor questions from the audience. Thank you and goodbye from me, and welcome, Rochelle.
Thanks so much, Mike, for those introductions, and thanks to you all for being here with us. We're really excited about this panel tonight. I'm coming at you from Cooperstown, New York, where I'm living temporarily this year in upstate New York, the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee. And I want to acknowledge the history of forced removal and genocide and the egregious attempts at cultural destruction that resettlement brought to the native peoples of this region and to so much of our country, as well as their ongoing presence and crucial contributions. At times at the forefront of our discussion tonight and at other times in the background is our shared understanding that any discussion of the natural world is a conversation about the human world, that social injustice is inextricably linked to environmental injustice. Our plan is for each of the panelists to speak briefly from our professional and personal lenses about what's at stake in terms of resistance and extinction today. And we want to consider what Henry David Thoreau might have to do with our current biodiversity and climate emergencies. We'll then have a brief conversation amongst ourselves before opening it up to the question and answer period. And as Mike mentioned, please enter your questions into the Q&A function. Finally, we want to dedicate this panel tonight to the memory of a dear friend of the Thoreau Society who passed away last year, Robert Bob Galvin. Bob was a devoted Thoreauvian, a regular, enthusiastic dedicated attendee of our annual conference in Concord. He shared his talents with the society as a lawyer. He was on our board. He was a good friend. And he continues to contribute his goodness to the world in bringing together this collaboration between the Thoreau Society and the Center for Biological Diversity. We couldn't be more pleased to be working with such an important organization in terms of the planet. I'm going to turn things over now to Peter, who's going to be our first presenter.
Thank you, Rochelle, and thank you for that nice tribute to my father. It's been a difficult year, and this really is wonderful to be able to help remember and celebrate his life and love for Thoreau. And thank you, Michael, and the whole Thoreau Society. My late and dear father, Robert Galvin, was a deep admirer of Thoreau and the Transcendentalists. Hiking around Walden Pond with him and in the Maine woods, discussing Thoreau are some of the fondest and most formative memories of my life. I'm on my journey today because of these experiences. Well, happy Earth Day. In spite of all the difficult news that there is, lately there's been a little bit of good news to cheer. Our new president has committed to join the movement to protect 30% of the Earth as protected wildlife habitat by 2030, 50% by 2050. He's just announced that the US will cut greenhouse gas emissions by up to 50% in the next 9 years. The Center for Biological Diversity and scientists believe that a 70% reduction at minimum is needed in the next 10 years. We'll continue to demand what is needed while we acknowledge and celebrate the promise of commitment, the promise and commitment of progress. We'll settle for nothing less than what is sufficient to the challenge. These announcements are a great example of Thoreau in his essay, Civil Resistance to Government, talking about basically how, in essence, the government, really when you look at it, corporations, institutions, the government, it's really just made up of people. And ultimately, so many of Thoreau's statements and writings have been translated into witticisms or even bumper stickers of today. But really, to boil it down, if the people lead, the leaders will follow. And this is a great example of someone, Joe Biden, not known to be a great environmentalist throughout his career, because of the public uprising, the tremendous public uprising demanding change, he has come around. And will it be enough? Is it enough? We don't know, but we're gonna continue to push until we get what is enough. But it's an incredible testament to the work that's been done by so many for so long to get where we are today. And just what a difference a year makes in the outlook of things. And we got a lot of tough things ahead of us, but things are looking up a little bit. That said, we're in a planetary extinction crisis, as you all know. Our web of life is being torn apart by rapacious human activities. The next 10 to 50 years will determine the fate of planetary survival as we know it. To me, Thoreau's words ring true today and are as relevant today as ever. Thoreau understood the need for systemic change. Thoreau was not a single issue activist. He knew that the enemy of inaction was, more than anything else, the apathy of basically good people. Thoreau stated in various different ways that good, regular, honest citizens must rise up and demand systemic change. His writings strongly suggest a path of solidarity with our brothers and sisters of all races and backgrounds. Thoreau knew that achieving that systemic social change and environmental justice were inextricably linked. He also was very aware of the extinction crisis. Something I'd like to read that Thoreau wrote in his journals. When I consider that the nobler animal have been exterminated here, the cougar, the panther, lynx, wolverine, wolf, bear, moose, deer, the beaver, the turkey, and so forth, I cannot feel as if I lived in a tamed and as it were emasculated country. It is not a maimed and imperfect nature I am conversing with. Thoreau understood the loss. Thoreau wrote about the loss. He felt the loss. He understood what was at stake. He he was connected to so many different issues of his day. He was really far ahead of his time in terms of understanding the links between social justice and planetary survival. You know, one of the things he wrote about that was very interesting was the apathy of good people. And he understood that most people would not rise to the challenge, but realized that it only took a few, really a very few, could change the world. And that these few would be beacons of light and people who would engage in dialogue with their fellow citizens, so they too could see a shining light or an example. You know, it's interesting, you look at the predicament that we're in, and systemic structural rapacious capitalism is undoubtedly one of the dominant threats that the planet faces. But let's face it, there were only 4 Koch brothers. Even all of their money and the Exxon company and the fossil fuel industry, we can't just entirely blame them for our predicament, because in one way or another, we, or some of us at least, allowed this to take place. It's our apathy, because we were busy doing other things, because we had lives to lead. And Thoreau recognizes in his essay, Civil Resistance, which is, my father always said, and I, as I get older, believe it is one of the most important, if not the most important essay written in American literature, that the inaction of good people is one of the key, the apathy is one of the key determinants of the lack of change. You know, the system that would mercilessly repress and systematically defraud so many people is the same system that thinks nothing of liquidating a rainforest or building a big box store on a wetland under the euphemistic terminology of monetizing assets. Thoreau has inspired so many throughout history, and many of the people on this webinar have written about this. You know, everybody from Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Rachel Carson. Thoreau was a literary outlaw of his day, a rebel, an outlier. He was lampooned or shunned by many as being strange or off-putting with his fervent critiques and beliefs and critiques of institutions and even his fellow citizens. You know, it's interesting looking, you know, you mentioned that Barry Lopez, Laura mentioned that is a kind of a modern day Thoreau. And I see, of course, she's her own person and her greatness is her own, but I see Greta Thunberg as someone who reminds me of a Thoreau of her day. And I see a connection between these great figures capturing our imagination and really a once in a generation person who can reach people where others couldn't. And so with that, I would like to pass it on by just celebrating Thoreau and reiterating that the modern environmental movement, as many have written, owes much to Thoreau. And one of his great and enduring contributions is the experiential and personal nature of Thoreau's experience. He didn't just write about these things, he was living these things. He wrote, "Let your life be a counter friction to the machine." You know, the free speech movement, Mario Savio took that up over 100 years after that, with virtually the same verbiage. So we owe a lot to Thoreau, and he still inspires us today. Thoreau was fighting for justice, fighting for liberty, fighting against the extinction of the planet and the human spirit. And that fight is alive and well today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. I work in the environmental humanities, which means that I think about what it means to be human in the natural world. And I also think about what it means to be just one element of the natural world that happens to be human. We know that part of Henry David Thoreau that encouraged us to get off the well-worn tracks of social and environmental injustice. He encouraged us to resist, as Peter just so eloquently reminded us. Thoreau told us to make our own lives a counter friction to that machine, whether the machine was an unjust government or extractive industrial capitalism or environmental degradation. He resisted, but he also grieved. He grieved what he saw in terms of environmental losses. And that's the side of his work that I want to focus on for a few minutes now. Peter, I'm going to turn to that exact same journal passage that you just turned to. And if folks want to look it up someday, this is Thoreau's journal entry for March 23rd, 1856. It's quite a long entry. I'm only going to read a little bit of it. But I want us to focus on his grief for just a minute. He's watching the spring come in. It's late March. And as Peter said, he's noticing all the animals that formerly had been in his home landscape, but that aren't there anymore. They're now regionally extinct. And he writes, "Is it not a maimed and imperfect nature that I'm conversant with?" He goes on then to say, "Do not the forest and the meadow now lack expression?" And then he says, "When I think what were the various sounds and notes, the migrations and works, and changes of fur and plumage, which ushered in the spring and marked the other seasons of the year, I am reminded that this, my life in nature, this particular round of natural phenomena that I call a year, is lamentably incomplete. I listen to a concert in which so many parts are wanting." That's a statement of personal grief. And we can relate to that statement today. I mean, the staggering statistics that we hear about loss to the Earth's concert. Here are just a few that I encountered this week alone, that the numbers of freshwater animals, including frogs, have declined by 79% in the last 40 years, that the number of marine species declined 39% in the last 40 years. And then a recent study showing that nearly 1/3 of all North American birds, 3 billion creatures, have vanished in the last 30 years. I'm a writer, and I write about 19th century naturalists like Thoreau, but I've been drawn to these earlier expressions of grief over similar losses to those that we're feeling now. Henry David Thoreau's contemporary, Susan Fenimore Cooper, who lived here in Cooperstown, New York, which is why I'm here right now, she similarly lamented diminishing numbers of species in the middle of the 19th century. She similarly pointed out regionally extinct species. She wrote about invasive plants that were driving out native ones. She wrote about mammals gone from her area. She wrote about birds again and again. Fascinatingly, she wrote about birds for over 40 years. So she had kind of a 40-year window to be studying the bird species in her particular neck of the woods. And she noticed their declining numbers in flocks. There were fewer and fewer nests. She counted them each year in the area, noticeably falling numbers of birds. And that was 170 years ago. I'm convinced that we cannot even imagine the abundance that this land once knew. We're living in a time of profound environmental grief, and we've not figured out how to allow ourselves to feel this immeasurable loss. We know that making meaning of grief involves telling the story of the loss over and over again. These early writers can help us learn that story so that we know it, so we can tell it to ourselves and our children, so we can begin to make meaning of it all, find hope, and move on. I find it empowering to know that writers 170 years ago resisted extinction through their writings. They can help us learn how to grieve, how to resist further extinction, how to rewild so as to turn the corner on those subsequent losses, how to do all that we can for everything that remains. I want to close with a quote by Robin Wall Kimmerer. She just said this recently in an online Zoom presentation. "We are living," she said, "in the time of a great remembering." That applies to so many aspects of our society right now. But early natural writers can help us remember, and in remembering, there's healing. I want to turn things over now to Laura.
Thanks, Rochelle, and thanks, Peter and Tierra and Mike. Just very quickly to acknowledge that I am on the land of the Pokagon Potawatomi, relatives of Robin Wall Kimmerers, and want to acknowledge that they have been on this land, using it for teaching, for education for thousands of years, work that they still continue today. And I'm honored to feel that I am in some part part of that tradition, as was Thoreau, in ways that I think are really relevant today. And I'll say a few words about that. And yes, I think we're all looking at that same passage of Thoreau's, March 23rd, very early spring in 1856, when his thoughts were turning to what are, in a sense, the wrong side of Noah's Ark, right? I mean, Noah's Ark is a wonderful biblical story of all that was saved, and it becomes our world that was saved, right? But when one tells that story, one doesn't think of all that must have been lost. And it's as if Thoreau is looking on the backside of that tapestry and seeing all that we had lost, that he had lost, that were lost, as if we forget how many there must have been. So his list: the cougar, the panther, lynx, wolverine, wolf, bear, moose, deer, the beaver, the turkey. It's an extraordinary list. And when I think about it, I try to visualize this for my students by showing them pictures of each of these animals, and then I make them disappear one by one, and you watch the world go blank. It rends my heart every time. There's a kind of post-apocalyptic feel to it, as if Thoreau is realizing that he actually does live, and again, all these 150, 170 years ago, in a post-apocalyptic moment of his own. And it moves me that he associates this, this long passage several times with the Indians. He feels that somehow the creatures he misses, it's like, if I were to study a tribe of Indians, he says, that had lost all their warriors. He moves forward and thinks about all the phenomena by which the Indians mark the seasons are no longer to be observed. And this is part of the tragedy of it, that recalls him through memory, thinking about what they saw, and also through his own investigations of what the first settlers saw. So if we ask what allowed him to flip the tapestry over and see what was lost, see what could no longer be seen or observed, this is fascinating to me. He'd spent over a year going through colonial records, and a little more than a year before, he writes what I think is the precursor passage, and it's a very long one. He'd been reading William Wood's New England's Prospect, first-hand account from 1633, just before the foundation of Concord. And he goes through page after page after page, all the abundance from the eyewitness account, none of which he can see any longer in the New England of 1855. And so the archives that he searches through extends the memory, since no human life could possibly encompass this or realize this kind of loss. So the cosmos looks, as he says, complete and entire to us, to each new generation. That becomes our baseline for the normal. And the shocking thing for us to read Thoreau, reading the past, is to realize that this baseline has shifted so radically down through the generations to where Thoreau himself couldn't conceive the abundance. And we look at his world and we see abundance that we can barely conceive. In other words, our human lifetimes blind us to the scale of the earth. And that's when Thoreau tries to see on the seasonal scale, these seasonal observations, the way all the earth's beings bring the seasons about, that sense that somehow they bring about time, they bring about the earth, they bring about the life that is, in a real sense, his life too. And I appreciate, Peter, when you say that about experiential, because this becomes so personal for Thoreau. It's a personal loss, which he does grieve, and he does feel himself maimed as a human being. He cannot express his full humanity because of the gravity of this loss. So how can you see your own full humanity and that of others? How can you see the full being of the planet of Earth and all its beings and not be blinded? Well, on the first hand, because you can learn to read, and in this sense, reading the planet, reading the beings around you, as Thoreau teaches himself to do and records in his journal. You can read the grammar of books and the kinds of colonial records, but perhaps most interestingly here, you can turn to those who are still on the land, who can tell you how they have been reading what Robin Wall Kimmerer again calls the grammar of animacy. And what moves me next about this passage that we're focusing on is to remember that he was very ill at the time he was writing this, and he spent the next year recovering. And the first thing he did when he was strong enough was go to Maine and try to immerse himself in the land and culture of the Penobscot, and in a real sense apprentice himself to Joe Polis, allowed himself to learn a little of that grammar of animacy, to learn to see the survivors in the Penobscot and all that they represented to him of what had been an apocalypse before, the apocalypse that the white settlers visited on the native peoples of the Americas. So here were the survivors, and they became Thoreau's guides and his mentors for how he might survive and pass on to us thoughts about how we might survive the apocalypse that we are still visiting on the planet. So I'll pass this on to Tierra. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. There's already so much to unpack. I just want to start talking to you all. I am going to share some slides that I made. So can you see my screen? Yes. All right. So I'm a senior scientist in our Saving Life on Earth campaign. Happy Earth Day. Things look pretty bad today, but things looked pretty bad 50 years ago in 1970 as well. Rivers were catching on fire. There were giant oil spills. DDT hadn't been banned yet. Eagles and pelicans and peregrine falcons were all declining. And even amongst like all of the bad things that are happening today, some things have gotten better. Water quality has improved in a lot of places. The pelican and the eagle and a lot of the species that were harmed by DDT, the American alligator, are increasing. And a lot of that is because of things that happened because of the first Earth Day. And I found this quote today and just wanted to kick things off my part of the talk with it. So one of the primary starters of Earth Day was Wisconsin Senator Gaylord Nelson. And in 1972, 2 years after the first Earth Day, he said, "Our goal is not just an environment of clean air and water and scenic beauty. And of course we want those things, but the objective is an environment for decency, quality, and mutual respect for all other human beings and all other living creatures." And that's really where our work is based, that all injustice is intertwined. All boats are going to rise on the tide of rising justice, and that as we fight for biodiversity, we also have to fight for human rights and fight racism and fight all of the other things. And so I just wanted to ground this in that. I am joining today from Shawnee territory, just to back up a little bit. So this is the poster we made for Earth Day last year. Artist Maybelle Equi made it, and it shows that one species vanishes just about every hour. We lose about 22 species a day to extinction. And so during this webinar, we're going to lose a species to extinction. And the United Nations in 2019 put out a report saying that 1 million species are at risk of extinction. And that is an overwhelming, depressing statistic. But it's not saying that 1 million species are doomed to extinction. It's saying that they're at risk. So it's up to us, now that we have this information, to take the action to save them, so that in 50 years, people can say they saved 1 million species from extinction. The last couple of years have been pretty bleak in terms of overall planetary reports. Rochelle mentioned the World Wildlife Fund Living Planet Index earlier. They reported an average 60% decline in monitored vertebrate populations since 1970. So that's not extinctions, that's vertebrates that people are out counting. So they have the actual population size. And on average, they've declined by 60% since the first Earth Day. The other big depressing report is the International Union for Conservation of Nature. That's a macro group of environmental groups, and the center is actually one of those groups now. They are working to assess all of the species. So far, they've assessed about 140,000, and they determined that 1 in 4 species are at risk of extinction. So we have a lot of work to do. And if you just look around, you can see this happening. Like once common species like bumblebees, monarch butterflies, frogs, bats, lightning bugs, or fireflies, as a lot of people call them, all of these things are disappearing in the shifting baseline that Laura was talking about. So things are bleak, but awareness is growing, and you're on this webinar, and this is going to be my most depressing slide. I actually was giving a talk one time and people walked out of the room when I started talking about the recent extinctions in the United States because they were so depressed. And so this talk is about resistance and extinction and hope and despair. And I don't want to depress you, I want to motivate you, because we do have to process that grief, but then we have to take the love that we have for these species and turn it into action. So I actually want to uplift you and motivate you by showing you some of the species that we've lost recently. The Franklin's bumblebee from California and Oregon was last seen in 2006. The South Florida rainbow snake was declared extinct in 2011. The pu'u'uli from Hawaii, where a lot of species are going extinct. The southeastern United States is a hotspot like Hawaii for extinctions. We've lost 71 species of freshwater snails and 38 species of freshwater mussels, which are all just super important in the ecosystem. And we're not going to lose any more. So how are we going to do it? Well, first let's talk about what's causing all of these extinctions. E.O. Wilson, the famous biologist from Harvard, the father of biodiversity, uses the acronym HIPPO to remember the drivers of extinction. So HIPPO stands for habitat loss, invasive species, pollution, population growth, and overutilization. So the animals that I put on here, that's a big sandy crayfish. It lives in Kentucky and West Virginia and is threatened by coal mining pollution. The pangolin is the most trafficked animal in the world. It's trafficked for its scales because they're believed to have medicinal value. The butterfly you see is an El Segundo blue butterfly, and it's sort of hard to get people motivated about fighting invasive species, but it is one of the major drivers of extinction. And sometimes the process is really simple. Like a lot of butterflies have a very specific host plant. So when invasive plants move into its habitat, its host plant declines and then the butterfly can't reproduce. And so for the El Segundo blue, it's the coast buckwheat. So that's a plug to get motivated, to get more people to care about it restoring native vegetation. And then the mammal on the screen is the Bramblecay melames. It was declared extinct in 2019. It was the first mammal to be declared extinct because of climate change impacts alone. It lived on an island off of Australia and its habitat was lost to rising sea levels. And that is a big wake-up call. And when that happened, Australian Senator Janet Rice said, extinction is a political choice. And that resonated with me so hard because it is a political choice and we can make a different choice. And so that's what this movement is about making that choice to end extinction. And I was talking to a college class last week and gave them HIPPO, and they actually dated me because they're like, no, now climate change is in there too. And I can't remember if they said it's CHIPPO or HIPCO, but from 10 to 30% of species are threatened by climate change impacts alone, such that even if we protect their lands like Joshua Tree National Park or the International Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve in Mexico or Glacier National Park, climate change is going to undermine the things that those places are named for. So like the Western Glacier stonefly that you see here only lives on glaciers in Glacier, which is going to lose its glaciers by 2030. Unless we cut carbon emissions by 70% by then, which we're going to do because the people are leading, like Peter said. So if you're on this call, you know that we're out in the streets before COVID. We had Frost Paw following all the presidential candidates around, demanding that they declare the extinction crisis a national emergency. And so we're working to get President Biden to declare the extinction crisis to be a national emergency and to protect a lot more species under the Endangered Species Act, because that's the most powerful tool we have to fight extinction. And in the center's history, we've gained Endangered Species Act protection for more than 700 species and more than 500 million acres of their habitat. So that's a really good start. And we have this Saving Life on Earth policy plan. Sorry. If you go to savelifeonearth.org, you can read all about the plan, and there's some links to some action alerts that you can take. Right now, we're asking people to put pressure on President Biden to declare the extinction crisis a national emergency. He's already committed to protect 30% of US lands and waters by 2030. We also want him to prioritize public lands for biodiversity protection and carbon storage, and not fossil fuel extraction and logging and mining and grazing. So I don't have time to go into all the elements of this plan, but you can find it at savelifeonearth.org. And the good news is we have a macro plan, we have momentum, we have 2 years of a lot of power in Washington to make these things happen. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and just open up this time, the next 5 minutes, for a discussion with the panelists before we open it up to public questions. And I just want to say, it's very interesting to me that all of you picked the same passages. You didn't like coordinate that, but you picked, and they were like the specific species, like the faces of the species that were lost. I thought that was very interesting.
Thoreau does write elsewhere about species, but we did all happen to choose that passage.
Well, I think it's his most sustained meditation. There are other times, Rochelle's point about grief is so important. There were times when he has, just howls of grief about certain moments of acts of hunting or acts of just depredation. But in terms of like sitting down and explicitly thinking about extinction itself and what it meant, that really is the great moment when he turns and faces it straight on and at length. So there's a certain logic to it there. It's interesting because these are local extinctions, and they tell us a lot about the kind of diminished environment that he faced. And there's two things that are interesting. One is that he still loved it. He thought it was beautiful and rich and full, and found a full life in exploring its every nook and cranny. So that's important, because diminished, to us, it is a beautiful world, and it is a beautiful world. So, which is not to say that, we forget the loss. But the other thing is how many of these species, each of them has had a different fate. And the very fact that some of these species had come back, so deer came back, turkey, I have turkey in my yard often, that local extinction didn't mean they didn't mean for all of us forever, right? There were actions that could be taken, and there are actions that can be taken.
Even moose. In Framingham, where I grew up, no moose had been seen for 200 years. And sure enough, about 10 years ago, one showed up on the town square. And so
there you go.
Now, now it's, climate change is a massive
Yeah.
And so it's even with, as Tierra mentioned, a lot of species, humans have, when humans stop persecuting animals actively, they can thrive. And so it's really, it's like they can live with us. The real question is, can we live with them? And so when it turns out they can, that we can actually coexist real well if we just take some pretty minimal steps and not persecute them or have government programs to incentivize their destruction, et cetera, et cetera. Now, of course, as Tierra mentioned, all of that is threatened by climate change, which is, the greatest threat to wildlife and humanity itself. One of the things that struck me in rereading Civil Resistance was Thoreau's position on government. He was basically, he was pointing out the government can be, the government is easily taken over by people who don't have the best intentions. And I was thinking about his parallels during that day and then today. and writing about the evils of slavery and the Mexican War. And then, juxtaposing forward today, looking at how, in addition to the many other things, but that fossil fuel companies have basically, and polluters have basically taken over the government. And now, we've made some progress back with the current administration, but it's very interesting how, he saw that basically just because, like most of the damage to the environment that's been done, extinctions and all the greenhouse gases that have been pumped into the atmosphere, most of it was done legally under the authority and authorization of the government. And so, we see that, does that make it right? Does that make it correct? Does that make it morally acceptable? Is it our duty to rebel against that, even if it's done under the name of the law? It is. And it's interesting to see just, move, flash forward and backward as I read that essay, how relevant and prescient those words are and applicable today.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, thanks,
Absolutely
Peter.
right, yeah.
And I think also about all of the other voices today. We think of Thoreau as a naturalist, as a writer, as an abolitionist. And I think of all the other people who are working today at the crossroads of environmental justice and social justice, racism in particular, and just such a rich group of writers and activists who are taking Thoreau's place, right? And fighting that good fight that you're describing, Peter. Kimmerer, I'm thinking of Drew Lanham, thinking of Lorette Savoy, so many leading environmental writers.
Someone actually asked us to type the authors that you all have mentioned into the chat so that they can write down their names.
Sure, yeah.
And that's actually, go ahead.
A good transition to the questions?
It's a perfect
Okay, great.
Yeah, I want to see the questions too. We could talk, for 2 hours straight, I'm sure, but I'm really interested in hearing.
We've proven that, yeah. So, great.
Yeah, so the first question actually is exactly that. Someone asked about the connections between Thoreau and Mary Oliver, who is like a poet who writes to celebrate nature.
Yeah. I don't know as much about her work specifically. I'm wondering if Rochelle does. I know
a fair amount about her work. I think it's the person who posed that question probably sees that parallel. And as Laura knows well, I mean, Mary Oliver is she was also a recipient of the Thoreau Prize for literary nature writing, actually. But Mary Oliver passed away just a couple of years ago. Prolific poet who writes about the wonder of the very common habitats that she encounters on her own land at the shore, and writes about them in very accessible, moving ways. So Mary Oliver really became the people's poet, I think, as in representing the natural world. Was there a specific question about her, Tierra, or just if we see a connection?
Yeah, just about the connection.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a few Mary Oliver poems that are particularly memorable or famous. One of them is called Wild Geese, and in that poem, she writes about how she sees the natural world as, and these geese in particular migrating overhead, as kind of calling out to her to be wildness and to enter the natural world as the animal that she is and that we all are. Peter, some of your comments were making me think about that too, that one of Thoreau's gifts to us is to remind us how humanity is so inextricably linked to nature. We separate ourselves, as you're saying, from these species, and yet we're all the same matter energy in the end, and we're all the natural world. And Mary Oliver, like Thoreau, is really a wonderful proponent of that position.
So the next question is a little bit complex. I think, Peter, maybe the first part is for you, and then the second part is probably for Laura. Somebody asked about the current wolf slaughter, especially in Wisconsin, since they Lost Endangered Species Act protection. And they also wanted to bring up the connection of Barry Lopez and Thoreau and the book of Wolves and Men.
Yeah, well, there's been there's a constant effort on the part of the federal government and state wildlife agencies to get the wolf off the endangered species list. And we and others have been fighting this for a decade or more, and we've successfully sued to keep different wolf populations on the endangered species list, because we feel like they're still not by any means out of the woods yet in terms of their recovery. And Minnesota is the one I'm most familiar with. Recently, there was a case where a hunting group brought a suit demanding that a hunt be opened up. They found a sympathetic state court judge who ordered an immediate hunt. And before it could get to the Supreme Court, a quarter of the state's wolves were killed, or 20%. And so this is, we've had some progress in some states, but it's the agribusiness, the hunting, the hunting lobby has enormous power especially in rural states, and it's a huge battle. It's even even in the current administration. The Biden administration came in and ordered a review of the Trump decision to take the wolves off the endangered species list. And, you can be sure that the administration and Deb Haaland is getting enormous pressure from big agribiz and the trophy hunting lobby to open up, to not put wolves back on the endangered list. And so, this has been a battle for a long time, and the government had a bounty. They had the Fish and Wildlife Service had a bounty on wolves when it was first established, and so the persecution of wolves and carnivores is a intimate part of American history and lives on to this day, and is a major battle that we fight. And so the slaughter of wolves is sadly ongoing, and something that occupies a lot of our time. A whole team of people at the center in our carnivore conservation program who know far more about the specifics and details than I do. But rest assured that if someone is trying to harm a wolf or reduce its protections anywhere in the United States, we're trying to save the wolves, and are active in dozens of litigation actions and administrative proceedings and public organizing campaigns to help save the wolf. It's amazing what, there may have been some hundreds, no one I think knows for sure, but hundreds of thousands or even millions of wolves. And, it's really upsetting to me when the government says, well, if there's 5,000 of them or a few thousand of them, that we consider them recovered. This isn't recovered. This is a museum specimen at that point. We're fighting for a healthy, thriving ecosystem, and that isn't a museum. That's not a small preserve. That's the ecological integrity of the earth, of which we ourselves depend. If you look at the Lyme, and I'll stop here because I know I'm running over, but look at Lyme disease in New England. It's getting to the point where people are afraid to go outside and hike. What is the thing that would control the deer population? Carnivores, wolves. Mm-hmm. And so, we want to restore the balance. And these creatures all had a part in keeping the balance in our ecosystem. And you can't just start yanking out important pieces of the ecosystem and expect it to continue without catastrophic things happening. So let's restore the balance and get the wolves back to where they were.
Thanks, Peter. No more shifting baselines. Laura, do you want to touch briefly on the connection between Thoreau and Barry Lopez, and specifically the book of Wolves and Men?
Well, just very quickly, because I see how many questions there are now, and get to a few more of them. But Barry Lopez's book of Wolves and Men came out in 1976. And this was his first big breakthrough book. He'd written some others that didn't quite get the national attention. This one did. And I remember reading it. I was very interested in animal behavior, and I was shaken and moved by it. And it was a breakthrough book in terms of looking at wolves as conscious, intelligent, deeply complex beings whose intelligence is radically different than human intelligence. And then he also opens the scope of the book to look at how different people have looked at wolves across human history, and hunters and their relationship, why they hunt, wolves in American history, but also wolves in indigenous traditions, and the notion of how indigenous people think of a kind of holistic. So the wolf in a large, the wolf is part of, as Peter was saying, it's not an animal stuck in a place, that there's an entire complex of the natural relationships, ecological relationships in which the wolf is embedded, and you cannot understand any creature without understanding that entire embeddedness. So it was one instance, and the breakthrough in terms of scientific understanding, when literally I was in classes learning that animals were machines, and we had to sever ourselves from imagining that they had consciousness. And I knew that was wrong, but to read Lopez's book and find somebody who was looking intently at both the way sciences can give us deep understanding, but also the way other forms of understanding were needed to complete this circle, a circle that would never truly be complete. This is what I mean about Thoreauvian. This is the kind of embodied, embedded, holistic work. I could go on about that too, but let's.
There's so many great questions pouring in. I'm going to take another big connecting one. Is Thoreau an ecofeminist? And did he see the world through the influence of his mother, sister, Mrs. Alcott, and the editor Dial with Emerson? Ecofeminism and Thoreau.
Well, short answer is yes. I bet Rochelle could take it a little more. I mean, I'm happy to talk about that, but I don't want to hog the time.
Laura could tell us a lot, and does so beautifully in her biography. We'll get this title in too, but Laura here has her biography of Henry David Thoreau, and she tells us about his relationship with the women in his family, especially his sister Sophia is doing botanizing with him and helping with his writing. And so, Laura, this is really your question.
Okay, I just didn't want it because I know you're working with Susan Cooper. Well, the exciting thing there, and really one of the things that moved me to want to write this biography, was when I started to realize how, you just sort of do the math. Thoreau grew up and lived his whole life in a household that was composed almost wholly of women. His sisters, his mother, his aunts, and they were smart, active, vibrant, exciting, intellectual women. And he was from childhood on, what he learned and how he became, how he learned to relate to the world and to engage in the world through, say, the underground movement that the women in his family joined to end slavery, the anti-slavery societies, which they were leaders in. All of this instructed him in things like civil disobedience. His first teachers were, his mother and his sisters and his aunts. So yes, I could go on about that, but I hope that's enough to assure you that one of, I think, the features that makes Thoreau distinctive is that he was in fact attentive to and always sort of companionate with women in his life, much more so than you might think if you just read Walden and think of this solo man alone, right? Yeah.
Thanks, Laura. Peter, there's a question specifically referencing something you said. You used the term transcendentalists. And could you just elaborate on that briefly about transcendental philosophy?
Well, I'm really, not an expert in transcendental philosophy by any means, and I'm not even sure that I could adequately describe it. But, the works of Thoreau and Emerson and some of the other greats at that time exploring a kind of nouveau intellectualism or expression of connection with the natural world in ways that hadn't been done before. But, you know, rather than make a fool of myself, I'm going to just flat out say that though I was raised by a transcendentalist, I'm not so sure that I could define transcendentalism for you or that I should try.
Thanks, Peter. I remember being really excited learning about it in high school because I grew up in a really rural area and had never even heard of anything like that before. And I knew that I loved nature and I loved books. So I wouldn't try to define it either, but it was an important part of my teenage years. I want to keep going because there's so many questions. Or do you want to give like a 1 minute?
Very, very quickly, because that's the other book I'm working on. Transcendentalists took the religious faith that every single human being has what they called God within, right? So there is divinity within every human being, and they meant every, you know, all races, all colors, all genders. And so every human being had to be lifted up into equality, education, women's rights, all of it. But the exciting dimension that Thoreau added was to extend this sense of ensoulment by the divine to all non-human beings as well, which was really radical. So he looked at muskrats and, you know, he wrote of a tree going to heaven because a tree would have a soul, and he meant it. It's not a metaphor, he meant that. And that is transcendentalism squared, right? I mean, that's just up to the higher power. And that was his gift, moving that out into the ethics of transcendentalism, out into the world of the non-human or nature, what I like to think of as para-humans, our neighboring beings.
So I want to take a macro question, kind of beyond Thoreau. Someone just asked, what are we most optimistic about today as we discuss extinction and environmental justice?
Well, I mean, the president has said 30% of nature will be preserved by 2030, and that will, you know, we move from Obama's 25% emission cuts to 50% emission cuts, and neither is enough, but both are fairly impressive in terms of an initial down payment of a commitment. You know, time is running out, but as Tierra said, consciousness is increasing, and I'm pleased about that. And I feel like the pendulum swings back and forth, and we can't let it swing again. We just can't.
Yeah.
Can't let it swing again. And we got to keep the pressure on, and the pressure has to double, triple, you know, by 20x. And we got to push at multiple issues at the same time, because these issues are all interconnected. But, you know, there is some signs of progress amidst the warnings of doom, and we should celebrate that and press it harder.
I would say very briefly, what makes me optimistic is the resilience of nature and the resistance of nature. I mean, yes, as we said earlier, if you step back, nature and these beings, they will come back. There's immense energy and generative capacity if we just would stop harming. And the other is just I see it in my students. Of course, it's a picked group because they sign up for my classes, but the love for natural beings and it's there. They're trying to find an outlet, a connection, a way, but it is absolutely there and stifled in so many ways. But just again, it's like something caged, and you want to let it out, let it free itself and find expression. In wildness is the preservation of the world. We know that from Thoreau, right? That's still true. And that's what makes me hopeful, because the world is very wild.
Like Laura, I work with young people, and that's really encouraging to see their energy and their dedication. Communities are coming together and just saying we've had it, and we're going to make changes locally, and you know those communities can add up. But also the rewilding that we mentioned, you know, when Henry David Thoreau or Susan Fenimore Cooper were writing about all of these species that were gone, their northern forests were decimated at that time. And we brought them back. Not all the way, but we brought them back a lot. And we see the species return because of that. So that's, I've been doing lots of birding in the woods around here, and I'm realizing I'm encountering species that Susan Fenimore Cooper never saw. She couldn't see them. There wasn't enough forest for her to see them. And it makes me sad on her behalf. But it's also proof of that resilience that Laura is talking about.
It is amazing. My father would often say, juxtapose the forest level of Massachusetts and Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine in the 1700s and the 1800s and then today. To the point where at one point Vermont might have been only 10 or 15% forest. And now it's back to, something like 75 or 70% forest. And I probably have the numbers off, I apologize. But the point there is, nature is incredibly resilient. And, to the point where at one time, there was a report issued that some of the species that were most threatened in Western Massachusetts were birds that depend on grasslands. And they were doing a little better when they were, clearing the forest. Now they're having trouble because the forest has come back so much that they actually have to, in some areas, go create some habitat for these birds so that there's a little opening. So it is amazing how resilient nature can be when we allow her to do that.
It absolutely is. And I love seeing all the fisher that have come back to New England, but we unfortunately are out of time. But thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to you at home for joining us. I know you had a lot of choices for your Earth Day webinar. Next week, our Saving Life on Earth webinar is going to be a film screening of Our Gorongosa about women's empowerment and environmental education in Mozambique. So you'll get an email on Sunday inviting you to that. And this video will post tomorrow on the Center for Biological Diversity's YouTube channel. So you can share it with your friends who couldn't make it. So thank you all so much. And thank you to Griselda. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.